If I could describe Mosaic in one word, it would be family.
Heaven.
Phenomenal.
Inclusive.
Home.
Sanctuary.
Compassion.
Empowerment.
Comfort.
Saving.
Diverse.
Hope.
Excelente.
When you think about giving to Mosaic, you have to think about how close we all are to this. How close are we to issues of domestic violence? Is there a neighbor, a friend, a family member who at some point has experienced that? And haven't you wanted to see them break the cycle? This is an organization that does that. They intervene, they counsel, they help people find a way out. And so it's time we break the cycle. So when you give, think about that.
What makes Mosaic unique is how we have so many different departments just in one agency, and that anyone that's in need can come to us and find all the help that they need.
There's counseling, there's case management, there's legal services. And so we're not just a place to keep someone safe, we're also a place where we can provide everything for our clients.
We save people's lives every single day.
I know that changing the world is very difficult, but you can definitely change the life or the world of those people whose life you touch. And then in return, they change your life as well.
I think the work that I do makes a difference because it's giving the children that have been through trauma, it's giving them a sense of hope.
What makes Mosaic unique is our commitment to making sure that every survivor has access to our services and opportunities, regardless of what language they speak or where they come from.
The challenges that I come across in my work had to do with funding support, especially because most of our funding come from government and it's not always guaranteed.
The reality is without funding, we are unable to provide as much work as we want to survivors of domestic violence.
Everything changed in my life when I started getting help through Mosaic.
I don't know that I can remember a time in my life before violence.
I was this woman who was going through so much abuse. I lost my self-esteem. I lost myself.
And I lived with my 2 special needs children in an apartment.
I began to experience sadness, feelings of grief, and even anger for what had happened to me, but mostly at myself for having allowed it to happen.
Tranquilidad, dormir mejor, tener una vida segura, seguridad en mi casa, que no había agresor en mi casa.
I got a new boyfriend with my kids, and it was all of us that were abused. So when I found out my kids were being abused, I'm like, this is not gonna happen. We're out.
When I found shelter at Mosaic, I started to feel hopeful.
I don't have to walk on eggshells with someone in the house anymore. I don't have to worry about my children being hurt when I'm not there.
Me siento como una mariposa, la verdad, feliz.
I'm free.
I just felt like there was hope ahead of me.
All 3 of us, our whole attitude towards life, there was more hope.
If I could say anything to anyone who's in a position similar to me, it would be to never give up on themselves and never give up on their dreams, because you have no idea how powerful your passion can be when you apply it with an open heart.
So this is like the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, and there's tangible evidence that it's making a difference, and it's hard not to feel compelled to get involved.
Please join me in welcoming Mosaic Family Services Executive Director and Founder, Dr. Walter Wynn.
Good evening, and thank you all for joining this conversation. This is our very first virtual event. As you have heard, my name is Walter Wynn, and I am the founder and executive director of Mosaic Family Services, and I've been with Mosaic for 27 years. A little bit of history. Being a former refugee from Vietnam who escaped successfully from a repressive regime and found freedom in America, I have decided to pursue a career in the helping profession. After completing graduate school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and then in Arlington, Texas, my dream became true when I found Mosaic. When I became the executive of Mosaic, we were helping newly arrived refugees access medical and mental health care with 6 employees, and we served about 400 clients in the first year. Today, we have 75 employees and a plethora of services that serve over 25,000 people through direct outreach and education services. We are proud to be an agency where diversity and inclusion are what keep everyone together, focusing on what matters the most, our clients, who do not know where to turn to for help because of the barriers they face as immigrants and refugees. These barriers, such as cultural differences and lack of English, have prevented them from accessing the services they need to rebuild their lives. Regardless of whether they are newly arrived refugees who fled persecution or wars in the countries of origin, or victims of domestic violence, or victims of severe forms of human trafficking, they all are trauma survivors. What did these survivors have in common? The basic human rights that every human being in a free society is entitled to no longer exist for them. That is why they come to Mosaic Family Services for help. As Mosaic, we envision the world that values human rights for all. Our mission is to transform, educate, and empower our clients to rebuild their lives through culturally competent services. Our goal is to offer all the tools in one safe place that a person may need to build a free and independent life. Our doors are open to all women, men, and children who seek refuge and hope after surviving violence, regardless of where they come from, including the United States. With as a staff to speak over 25 languages and the ability to access another 250 languages through interpretation services, no survivor will be denied services because they do not speak English. Best of all of our services are free of charge. Let me talk about the event tonight. Our purpose is to have an intimate conversation with our supporters about human rights. We want to share with you what we do and how you can be an advocate, especially during these challenging times. We have asked you to send us your questions so we can review them ahead and make the best use of our time together tonight. And you can ask questions live right now in the chat. We will try to get to all of your questions if time permits. If not, please be sure to contact us and we'll be happy to answer those questions later. At this time, I would like to acknowledge the sponsor, because without them, this event would not be possible. I'd like to thank Flight to Freedom for their platinum sponsorship. I'd like to thank WPW Consulting and Whitney Warren, attorney at law, for their gold sponsorship. I'd like to thank Cameron Smith Law and Greenberg Trowbridge for your silver sponsorship, and all the rest of our sponsors. We thank you from the bottom of our heart. You all have been true advocates for human rights. So we have an exciting conversation in store for you with some great speakers. To start the night off, I would like to introduce you to the moderator of tonight's conversation, Noel Mendoza. Noel is the program director of our Human Trafficking Outreach Program. And Noel has been with Mosaic for almost 10 years. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Noel to the conversation. Thank you. Noel.
Thank you, Dr. Nguyen. First, let me thank you for sharing such a powerful story with us, which is your own, and for establishing a vital resource that has reached and helped so many vulnerable persons and survivors that have needed it. Thank you for that, and thank you for the work that Mosaic does on a daily basis. As Dr. Nguyen mentioned, I am Noel Mendoza, and I have the pleasure to be moderating the conversation tonight. As Dr. Nguyen said, please submit your questions as we want to have this conversation with you, our community. Before we start, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself, as well as the topic experts that you will be meeting in a few minutes. Dr. Nguyen mentioned that I am the Human Trafficking Outreach Program Director. And in that role, I have witnessed the complexities of crimes such as human trafficking. And for that reason, I have made it a priority of our program to ensure that people get a comprehensive understanding of the problem and the profound impact that it has on the lives of victims and survivors. So for that reason, it gives me great pleasure, again, to be here with you tonight to carry on the conversation and continue the awareness, but also to be an employee of Mosaic Family Services. Now that you've heard a little bit about me, let me introduce you to our highly esteemed colleagues. First, Bill Bernstein. Bill Bernstein is Mosaic's Deputy Director. He has been with Mosaic since 1996. As the founder and catalyst of the Multicultural Family Violence Intervention Program and our services for trafficking persons in our tenure, he has a wealth of knowledge on the matter. Thank you, Bill, for joining the conversation. Next, please let me introduce Sulan Chang. Sulan is a program director of our Victim Services Department. She has 13 years of experience working with survivors as well as program management. She collaborates with an amazing team to provide trauma-informed and survivor-centered services to support and empower survivors. Thank you, Sulan, for joining the conversation. So why don't we get things started with the first question we received, and I will ask Bill to answer first, and Sulan, please feel free to share afterwards. Seeing as to how this conversation is centered around human rights, Bill, I think it's apt to ask, what is your definition of human rights? Bill, you're on mute.
Thanks for that. Thanks to you, Noel, and thanks to everyone who's watching and listening. Since our main topic tonight is about human rights, I had a little suspicion that might be a question, so I thought we'll start with a general overview of what's an internationally accepted definition of human rights, and then Sulan will bring it back to us and how we view it personally. I'm giving really a summary from the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that these are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, nationality, sex, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more. Everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. Sulan?
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for being here again. I would just have to say I really agree 100% with what Bill has said, and would just like to add that, for me, human rights is really about valuing individual lives and the basic idea of treating others the way that you want to be treated, with dignity, fairness, and respect. And I think when you're talking about having a human rights approach, it's really both about protecting and fighting for individuals' rights and also advocating for change in our current communities, systems and institutions and policies that really prevent access and opportunity. It's also about addressing the root causes of poverty, discrimination, and other issues that make individuals and communities more vulnerable to being exploited or victimized.
That's a great point. Sulan, and Bill, you mentioned that human rights, again, include the right to life, liberty, or freedom. Sometimes when we think about human rights, they seem like really big ideas, and we think about international crises whenever we talk about human rights. But it's important to know that such like domestic violence and human trafficking, though they are huge societal issues, they also happen in intimate spaces and amongst intimate relationships. So for that reason, Sulan, how are domestic violence and human trafficking violation of human rights?
I think that when it comes to domestic violence, everyone should have the right to live their life free of a fear of abuse, free of violence. There's really a lot of definitions for what is domestic violence, but the one I typically use is that domestic violence is about one person exercising power and control over another person in a relationship, and not necessarily just in a romantic relationship. I think that most often we think about intimate partner violence between spouses, but domestic violence can exist between any adult or teen dating relationship or relationships between other family members. And the power and control tactics that are commonly used can come in many different forms beyond just physical abuse, including sexual abuse, verbal, emotional, psychological, financial, stalking, harassment, and much more, which I think we would really all agree would not be the way that we would want to be treated, and we would not, it would not be acceptable to treat somebody else in these ways. And I'm thinking, Bill, would you like to answer about human trafficking?
Yeah, although, we've become real familiar with the term these days, human trafficking, when we talk about this crime, we really should be aware that trafficking in persons doesn't require movement. It's just the control of one person from another person or entity through some form of coercion almost always. So we're really talking about a form of modern slavery. And that's, by the way, the term used by the government. We see that even in this general definition that I quoted earlier from the United Nations, freedom from slavery is included. Similarly, where domestic violence occurs is a form of torture, lack of freedom, inability to express oneself, and so on. A simple way of defining human trafficking is using force, fraud, or coercion to control another person for an improper purpose, including forced labor or sexual exploitation. Just this morning, I was walking in my neighborhood, I saw a sign that said, "Women's rights are human rights." Now, some of us might feel that this is obvious, but for most of human history, this wasn't the case. Remembering what human rights encompass, it's pretty clear to all of us that family violence and human trafficking are a gross violation of the human rights of any person. And our work is based on human rights.
Thank you. As you were speaking, I heard both of you mention control, right? The use of control for the benefit of the victimizer. So I ask you this question because it's important to know that both domestic violence and human trafficking are issues that stand alone as the weight it has on our communities. But I'm sure, and I would like for you to see hear from you guys, how does domestic violence and human trafficking intersect?
I think I'll just go ahead and say that, like you mentioned, Noel, it is really important to acknowledge that domestic violence and human trafficking, and even when you're talking about sex and labor trafficking, they're all very different crimes, and they can really have very different impact and trauma for every survivor. However, I think that there can be a lot of overlap, especially when considering that there are often very similar risk factors and vulnerabilities that could lead someone to being exploited or abused in a relationship setting or in a work setting. There's often very similar tactics and types of abuse that are used against the victim in both situations, and the intervention services and the resources that are often needed to help survivors heal and rebuild their lives can also be very similar. When it comes to trafficking, oftentimes a romantic or family relationship is one of the tactics used by some traffickers to recruit, control, and exploit an individual. We have worked with a lot of survivors where their trafficker is their intimate partner or family member, such as a victim who is being forced to do sex work by their parent, or recruited for a false job or educational opportunity by a distant family member, or forced by a spouse to be a domestic servant, or the victim might have children with their trafficker. So there can really be a lot of overlapping dynamics to consider. And it's important to be aware of that intersectionality and the multiple victimizations because it helps us better understand the whole picture of a survivor's trauma and how to better support them.
I just want to add before we go on, for those listening, Sulan is really one of the foremost experts on this topic, the intersectionality of domestic violence and human trafficking. She's done webinars attended by those throughout Texas as well as across the U.S.
I agree with Bill on everything about Sulan. So Sulan, great work out there. So one question that I get whenever we provide public awareness and outreach efforts about both human trafficking and domestic violence is people want to know, is it happening in my community, right? So I put that question to you. How bad is domestic violence and human trafficking in Dallas?
Okay, Noel, I'll jump in and say that Dallas and the entire Metroplex area have seen some serious cases of human trafficking. One of our first cases, one of the earliest large cases in the country, was in this area. And then over time, as law enforcement, medical providers, social services agencies, and the general community have become more and more aware that human trafficking is reality, the referrals that we see have seen a steady increase over the years. This isn't because there's more trafficking today, it just means there's more awareness. We learned very early that trafficking is, as you might expect, a crime that's really hidden. A study by the University of Texas not too long ago estimated there are over 300,000 cases of modern slavery in the state. So we can easily get from this that there's got to be a large number of cases hidden in the Dallas area. And I have to always add that the majority of these cases, about 234,000 according to the study, are estimated to be labor trafficking. And the rest, about 79,000, are cases of sex trafficking. Reality is there's much more labor trafficking than sex trafficking in the world and in the US, but it's even more hidden and uncovered. At Mosaic, we've served many hundreds of trafficked persons over the years, evidence of this crime locally. And really, this is probably a small percent of the reality. Julianne.
I guess I'll just add that, trafficking and domestic violence can really happen anywhere and to anyone, regardless of race, gender, age, and socioeconomic status. And it is happening here in the Dallas area. Just to give you a better sense of domestic violence in Dallas, according to the most recent report provided by the City of Dallas DV Task Force, there were over 15,000 domestic violence related calls to Dallas Police Department. There were 32 domestic violence murders. And this is all in 1 year. And then there were survivors were denied a safe bed over 13,000 times due to lack of space in emergency shelters in our community. And when you're looking at really thinking through domestic violence in immigrant and refugee communities, it can be really challenging, as you can imagine, to find accurate data. We typically at Mosaic have served at least a couple of hundred survivors who are immigrant and refugees. And just wanted to provide a little bit of information so that you can keep in mind about immigrants and refugees in the Dallas area. Approximately 24% of Dallas residents are foreign born. 20% of Dallas residents are considered limited English proficiency. And there are over 200 languages that are spoken in the Dallas area. And I haven't really seen any hard data or studies that show that immigrants and refugee communities experience domestic violence at a higher rate. But there are other factors to take in consideration, such as immigrant and refugee survivors may often underreport and be less likely to seek help and often face additional vulnerability and barriers due to language, isolation, and immigration status.
Wow, Solana, listening to you mention the vulnerabilities and barriers, I think, and I have seen this in person when we're working with survivor advocates who join us in some of our presentations and trainings that we do for the public. One question that they always get, and it's a difficult question to ask, but I think it's human nature to be curious. I don't think it's done with any bad intention, but a question that many survivors get is, why don't people who are victims seek help? So let me put that question to you today. Why don't people who are victims of domestic violence and human trafficking seek help?
Yeah, thanks, Noel. I think really it is a really reasonable question, and before we start even answering that question, I just want to say that with regard to both trafficking and family violence, maybe the first question we should ask should be, why do abusers do what they do? Because that's really maybe our focus, but trafficked persons often don't self-identify. And that's why we believe there's so many more people that are being victimized than are identified. A lot of reasons for this. A person in that situation isn't allowed to make even basic decisions. So that causes post-traumatic stress, PTSD, where the thinking part of the brain shuts down. And if the trafficked person's foreign born, there's often a threat to their family back home. This kind of threat can be there even for Americans who are trafficked. For the foreign born, you've also got language barriers, cultural differences, and often real fear of authority that create strong barriers. There's an interesting statistic that those of us in this field have come to know that shows that about 80% of trafficked persons have seen a medical provider at some point without identifying their abuse. Just this morning, interestingly enough, in today's Dallas Morning News, there was an editorial about new legislation that becomes law this week, assuming really today, that requires training for all those in health-related professions. That's a very positive step. Sulan?
I think in addition to what you mentioned, Bill, there really are so many reasons why that make it really extremely difficult for both domestic violence and trafficking survivors to seek help. As you can imagine, there may be fear of the abuser or the trafficker and threats of physical harm to the victim or their loved ones, threats of taking their children away, threats of deportation. We often see survivors are afraid of not being believed, or even worse, there's a lot of victim blaming that happens, especially when there's sexual abuse or sexual assault or sex work is involved. Oftentimes we see with trafficking victims that they're often told that they themselves will get in trouble since the work that they're being forced to do is illegal, or they're working while being forced to work while undocumented. And we've also seen situations where domestic violence victims have been criminally charged or punished for fighting back against their abuser. We also see a lot of community and society pressure. Oftentimes, despite all of the awareness that has happened around domestic violence largely remains a private family issue. And it's really in the community, you're told not to air your dirty laundry. And victims are often the ones blamed or seen as the person that's breaking family units apart, especially in particular communities. And there's also a lot of sentiment about an abusive partner or parent is better than none at all. And then there's obviously fear of being ostracized or isolated from a victim support system. And then the only last thing I think I will add is that when you think about everything it takes for a survivor to access help and all the systems and all the agencies and organizations they may have to come in contact with, it's a pretty daunting experience for a survivor to have to go through. You're thinking about interacting with social services, police, CPS, protective order court, criminal court, family law court, housing, public benefits, mental health, hospital. It can be a very big ordeal, and it could be very, very challenging for survivors to be able to navigate all of those systems or know where to go for help.
And let me just say that that's why it gives me great pleasure that we're able to have these kind of conversations, because a seemingly very innocent and simple question like, why didn't you just leave, can actually also cause re-traumatization, or the person to feel as they cannot trust anyone, or they're not believed, right? So thank you so much for sharing that, and all of the factors that go into why folks it's difficult for them to get out of some of these situations. Let me kind of transition into the work that Mosaic does in respect to everything that you have discussed already, right? So what is it that makes Mosaic unique in working with domestic violence and human trafficking survivors? Sulen?
I think it's, again, it's important to first acknowledge that there really are a lot of great organizations serving survivors that we regularly work with, and that we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do without them and the community. That being said, I do think there are some things that makes us unique in the fact that, even just in this conversation, it is obvious that we serve multiple victimizations or survivors who have multiple victimizations, including domestic violence and human trafficking. And we really try to provide comprehensive wraparound services within one organization. And that includes the emergency shelter, the case management, counseling, legal, transitional housing, economic empowerment, and a lot more. I think what also makes us unique is the fact that we do intentionally have a multicultural approach that really takes into account challenges and barriers that makes it difficult for a survivor to access services in the first place. You can see that you've heard, several times throughout this conversation about our commitment to language access with multilingual staff. And we have often really seen that when we have a staff from a specific language community, we really see an increase of survivors from those communities reaching out to us for help. We also try really hard to make cultural accommodations, culturally appropriate accommodations for food and supplies, especially at our shelter. At our shelter, clients can prepare their own meals, and we make sure to provide culturally appropriate food and preparation and cooking equipment. And I know that seems like that's something that's maybe so basic or inconsequential, but we have seen time and time again that having food, having the right kind of food for themselves and their children can really make all the difference between whether a survivor decides to stay at our shelter or not. And the last thing I think I'll say that makes this unique is that we have really, really dedicated staff that really walk through survivors through every step of their journey. And they really go above and beyond to provide support, especially when there's additional challenges and barriers. We've had staff that have driven over 1 to 2 hours each way to interpret for a divorce hearing or to provide emotional support for law enforcement interviews. Our staff will go with clients to actually go look at new apartments and physically help them move in. We've had staff that ride the bus with clients to make sure they understand how to use the public transportation system. So those are just a few of the many examples of the work that we do.
Chelanne just gave some pertinent examples that we love to hear of what we consider our unique role in the Metroplex community. Another pretty important fact is that we do serve survivors of labor trafficking, as well as male survivors of both labor and sex trafficking. This is really pretty rare. We take the perspective that trafficking is trafficking, regardless of the type of trafficking or person being trafficked. I also want to reemphasize what Chelanne said about the additional level of support that we give. We don't just refer our clients to services. Case managers go with them. This makes all the difference in the world for these survivors. But it also means that almost every client we serve requires really just a great deal more time and resources than someone just getting a referral. So because of that, we need to spend more resources than we have. But we always try to hold firm to the theory, the belief that we're obliged to provide what it is that our clients need. So I'll close with that.
Thank you, Bill. Let me just say that I have been at the shelter when some of the residents are cooking, and they've offered me some of the meals, and delicious. Just to share that point there. But before we move into answering some of the questions from the chat, I did want to share one of the unique opportunities I had and honor in working with survivors who were clients of Mosaic, but now have been partnering with the Human Trafficking Outreach Program to provide advocacy for those folks who are still in this situation. That opportunity has been amazing. Again, I feel so honored being able to work with them, and just really happy to see the process, the healing process, all the way up to a survivor thriving and continue to be a support system for those who are still in the situation. So I just want to share a little bit of that. Let me thank Bill and Chelanne for answering these questions. I know some of them could be complex and we could go on for another day chatting about these, but let's answer some of the questions that we have on the chat. One of them here is, how has COVID affected your clients and your agency? And please feel free to jump in any order.
Sure, I'll start and then let Chelanne talk about some details. The most obvious example that people might guess is we operate a 24-hour shelter. And obviously we have to be extremely concerned for what goes on at the shelter. So as an example of that, we had a volunteer who came to the shelter one day, and then a couple of days later, someone in the family was positive. Then that person who had come to the shelter tested positive for COVID. So when that happened, we had to move everyone from the shelter, literally take everyone to motel rooms, hotel rooms, so that they could be safe, and then everyone had to be tested for COVID. So that's a little bit of a drastic example. One great thing is that a lot of the work, when you heard the descriptions of what our case managers do, most of it's not done in the office. They're out with clients. So working remotely is something that we're used to doing. So as far as that goes, we're able to continue doing it. But the challenge is, as far as getting the funding to do what we do, trying to handle the shelter, trying to just navigate these whole times have been very challenging.
I guess I will just kind of share from what we're seeing on the client's end. So as you guys can imagine, a survivor that we're working with is already facing a lot of trauma and abuse. And, having to deal with a health pandemic and having to deal with COVID during this time just adds an additional layer, an additional burden and challenges on top of everything they're already going through. We've really seen the difficulties that clients our survivors have had to choose between their physical health and physical safety. So we've often seen survivors struggling with the idea of being able to leave the abusive situation and decide if they want to come into a shelter setting, especially if they have kids, because they may not want to expose themselves and their children to the potential possibility of COVID in a communal living situation. We've also seen a lot of challenges with technology and for everybody, clients and staff having to switch over to more telephone, to video, to text, to phone. Some of our survivors don't even have a phone to begin with. So that has also been really challenging. We've also seen kind of an increased safety concern, safety risks, as most people or a lot of people are starting to work more from home. You can imagine that for survivors who have not left their abusive situation, they're still at home with the abuser, and they may be spending more time around the abuser. There might be more violence that could be occurring. There's just more time and more possibility or opportunities for violence to occur. And I think the other big impact that we're really seeing is loss of income, loss of jobs with our survivors, and which impacts their basic needs, their housing. And we've been seeing a lot of additional support needed and requests coming in from our current clients for support.
We have a couple more questions, and I'll combine two of them because they are running along the same vein. But it says, what can regular folks in Dallas do to help improve on these issues? And how can individuals help to continue the mission of Mosaic?
Right now, because of what's going on with COVID, the challenge is always using all the volunteers who would like to help at Mosaic. So we're very careful. A lot of the volunteer work we do is directed at the shelter because obviously there's a lot of needs there that volunteers can fulfill. But it's challenging in these times. So we do manage to find some things online so people can get involved in. There's like a lot of different things. And I think we'll address some of the more specific details about that later, how people can support Mosaic. But I would say just the awareness that people get today of knowing more about family violence, of knowing some of the reality of human trafficking, that's a huge step. I mean, anyone listening to this knows more than a huge percentage of the population about human trafficking, especially. So thank you again for listening.
And then finally, how long on average do clients stay at Mosaic? Do you hear from them after they left?
So that, we don't have one definitive answer for that. We don't really have timeframes for how long a survivor can receive services from our agency. It's really going to vary. We have survivors that engage with us for 3 months all the way up to a year, 2 years. It really depends on what their needs are. Oftentimes with legal cases, those take a lot longer. So we could be working with a survivor on legal needs for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, or, so it can take a while to get to accomplish all of the goals that a survivor sets. But on average, I would say that most survivors are with us between 1 to 2 years. And we've even had situations where clients, even after they graduate our program or accomplish all their goals, they do continue to keep in touch with with our staff, and they continue to give us updates about the important things that are going on in their lives, like getting a new job or kids graduating. We even had one of our survivors reach out to our case manager and invited her to her U.S. citizen naturalization ceremony. So I think that's speaks to the level of work that we're doing.
Awesome. Well, let me just take this opportunity to thank Bill and Sulan again, our truly topic experts, and very happy to thank also our community. Thank you for sharing these questions with us. As Dr. Nguyen mentioned in the beginning, if we didn't get to answer your question, please feel free to follow up with us using these different platforms. As we move forward, and to Bill's point about resources earlier, the constant need of additional resources, we know that one of the most important questions to answer during these kinds of events, and Bill kind of did in a way, is to share a way that you, our community, can continue to be engaged with the topics that we discussed, right? So with this in mind, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our development director, Mumtaz Begum, who will be sharing ways that you can all stay involved and continue to be true advocates for our survivors. Thank you again, Mumtaz.
Thank you, Noel. Hi, everyone. My name is Mumtaz Begum, and I am the Director of Development at Mosaic Family Services. I've been with Mosaic for almost 4 years, and my passion for our mission continues to grow every single day. I believe in Mosaic because the numbers speak for themselves. Last year, we helped 209 women and children find safety at our emergency shelter, Mosaic House. 157 trafficking survivors found freedom at Mosaic Family Services. 496 individuals and their families received legal assistance. These are just some of the numbers. In total, Mosaic Family Services provided direct services to nearly 10,000 people. I'd like to stop for a moment and really think about that. What does it mean to help nearly 10,000 men, women, and children? Many of the survivors we help have nowhere else to turn to. This is due to barriers of language, culture, immigration, or social and economic isolations. Mosaic doesn't exist because we want to, we exist because we have to. For us survivors, access to our services is a lifeline. As Dr. Wen mentioned, our staff is fluent in over 26 languages. This diversity and multilingual capacity enables us to reach and serve refugees and multicultural survivors of family violence and human trafficking who would otherwise not be served at traditional agencies. And most importantly, I want to reiterate over and over, all of our services are completely free of charge. So there are many ways in which you can help with Mosaic and be allies to us and our survivors. First, you can take out your phone, something that we use every single day, and you can text Mosaic Comms to 41444 and donate to us. So far tonight, we have raised $4,680. Thank you for everyone who has supported us, and please continue to share our message and help us reach our goal of $10,000. Another way for you to get involved is to volunteer virtually. As has been mentioned before, we have many ways for you to get involved. We are looking for people who are interested in doing a virtual volunteer project with our shelter. So all you have to do is go online, sign up, do the application form, and we'll get in touch with you. We've also created a list of 5 things you can do in 5 minutes. So number 1, you can download the Safe Night app and select Mosaic as your organization of choice. When a survivor is in need of an urgent bed, but our shelter is at capacity, the Safe Night app allows donors to cover the cost of the hotel fee. Number 2, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, we're everywhere. You can share our post, comment on there. We'd love to engage with you on the virtual world. Number 3, you can donate again by texting at 41444. There are other ways you can give as well. On our website, you can find a list of our most requested items, including our Amazon wish list. Number 4, we'd love for you to talk about this community conversation to your friends. Spread the word about Mosaic. We need to raise awareness about the issues our community is facing, especially in relation to human trafficking and domestic violence. And lastly, you can help us by promoting Mosaic Family Services for North Texas Giving Day. We'd love for you to create a fundraising page and spread the word about the amazing life-changing work Mosaic does. All of this information that I just mentioned will be emailed out after the program. Thank you again for being part of this conversation and wanting to stay involved with Mosaic. To close out the night, I'd like to invite our board chair, Kirk DeCardenas, to give closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Montaz. My name is Kirk DeCardenas, and I'm the chair for Mosaic's board of directors. I became involved with Mosaic when I learned about the pervasiveness of human trafficking in Texas and saw the injustice of it. And I'm very grateful to Mosaic for the opportunity they've given me to make a difference on the issue of human rights abuse in our community. I'd like to thank everyone for being part of this event. I'd like to thank our sponsors for being great partners for Mosaic. They make a lot of the work we do possible. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. As the panelists mentioned earlier, awareness is a big part of contributing to our mission. And you're raising your awareness and the awareness of our community does a lot. Special thanks to Noel, Sulan, and Bill for bringing their knowledge, experience, and insight about human rights abuses, especially as it pertains to our community. And thanks to all of them for the work that they do every day. They're on the front lines fighting this fight. They all serve as a beacon of hope to our clients and make everything possible. As Montaz was mentioning, we'd love for you all to stay involved with Mosaic. There's several ways you can do that. You can participate, in addition to what Montaz just said, you can participate in North Texas Giving Day. It happens on September 17th, but they've started early giving today. And you can find out more about that and everything else that we've talked about tonight at our website, mosaicservices.org. Once again, thank you all for being with us, and I hope you all have a good evening.